Janelle, can you dim the lights a little bit?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. All right. Yeah, that's good. Unless Kruger falls asleep on the dark side of the room.
Nope, I'll be fine.
Good.
Yeah, that Pink Floyd song, Dark Side of the Room. Or Dark Side of the Room.
Dark side of the moon, I think it was.
It is the moon, yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, we still need a few more people.
There's a couple people, I think they're just not on camera.
Okay, we can't see who they are. The screen. Can you shrink it just a little bit? I can't read across the room, my part.
Oh, what is this?
Oh, terrific. Very nice.
Got 8 members present today.
And we know Marta was not going to be with us.
And then Julio is here in person.
Yep. So that gives us 10. We're only missing 1. Right?
It's 4:05.
Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Sorry, we're just a couple minutes late. And I think everyone should have received the potential strategy list in their email and hopefully you've had time to look at it and think about it, as I think that's going to be much of the focus today as we begin to talk about what direction we would like this committee to concentrate on. Jen, would you, or Phil, would you like to pick it up from here? Thank you very much for all your work on this and getting this out. I think you, Jen, you had a chance to meet with Marta before, is that correct?
We didn't meet, but she did send me an email and a memo, basically with her input for today's meeting. So we do have that. But so great. I think the only person we're missing is Rodney, unless he's in person. But we'll go ahead.
He's not here.
Nope. Okay, there we go. All right, so today is the day that everybody has been waiting for. We're going to shift from talking about and defining the challenges associated with flooding in the city to actually talking about those potential strategies. And so the way we thought we would do that in an orderly fashion is to basically run through the strategies that you have on that menu before you. Which are really based on the conversations that we've had over the past several meetings, right? Nothing there should be new to you or a surprise. And have you, we can discuss them for the first portion of the meeting, and then we're going to take some time and actually vote on what kind of the preferred 5 strategies would be. And we'll use those 5 strategies as the framework for our upcoming meetings. So those will be the focus of the discussion. There may be strategies you think are missing. There may be more information that you want on these particular strategies, and that is something that we can talk about. But today, we've referred to these as kind of the levers that you get to pull. So today, the idea is picking which levers we want to pull, but not necessarily to what degree they're going to get pulled or what direction they're going to get pulled. So we don't want to get too far into those specific details. But we do want to, take the time and make sure that everybody understands what we have. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and jump into that strategy menu unless anybody has any questions or comments before we get started. Great. Okay. Share screen. Oh, can I have screen sharing abilities, please?
All right, you're good, Jen.
Great, thank you, Janelle. All right, so this is basically the menu that you all have with you. And I'm just going to take, hopefully 10, 15 minutes to walk through the strategies, make sure that everybody is clear on what they mean. But as I said before, we have best practice examples, and we have what Lewes's existing regulations are. The idea is to pick which one of these we want to discuss in more detail and dive into, not necessarily, if we did Freeboard, not necessarily saying we're going to go to 2 feet or 3 feet or something in between. So, so we'll start with the first one. Freeboard, I don't think needs a lot of introduction to you all at this point, 4 months into it. But as you know from Janelle's table that we looked at before, that the current required freeboard is 18 inches in the city. And so this committee can consider increasing that freeboard within the 100-year floodplain, is what the specific strategy is addressing. There are other communities, that will also adjust the building height accordingly. So if it is raised another 6 inches, maybe the maximum building height is also raised in that, and that's part of that conversation. The second one, regulating the 500-year floodplain. So just like regulating the 100-year floodplain, the 500-year floodplain, right now there isn't any regulations for it, right? This is the X shaded areas on the floodplain maps. And it basically, you could choose, if we look at this strategy, we'd be choosing to look at things like construction standards and how foundations are done, enclosures of the lowest floors. Freeboard was one of the things that we saw in Norfolk, as well as raising of utilities. So if we look at the 500-year floodplain, those are kind of the menu of options underneath that specific strategies that we would discuss. And it would be, the strategy would be new recommendations of the zoning ordinance that applies to properties in the 500-year floodplain. The next one is the V zone regulations to coastal A zone. And so the VE zone, just again, is the 100-year floodplain that is subject to the high velocity wave action. It's also called the coastal high hazard area. The coastal A zone is basically the area that is landward or inward from the V zone, but still has potential for those breaking waves. And so the principal source of flooding in these areas is tides and storm surges and erosion. Right now, Lewes does not has regulations for the V zone, but not for the coastal A zone. And I think, Jim, it was you brought up the fact that on the previous table that Janelle showed, it actually, it just said V zone to A zone and not coastal A zone. And there is a distinct difference between A and coastal A, and it is defined. And there are actually a couple of other communities, actually including Kent County in Delaware, as well as Fenwick Island, that do use that do regulate the coastal A zones. And so it is something that some other communities do. Kent County, interestingly enough, it's not an actual regulation. They provide an incentive to incorporate the same types of, looking at, again, construction standards for wind load, freeboard, enclosure of the lowest of the area below the base flood elevation. Those are incentivized in the Kent County ordinance. They are not a mandatory regulation. Let me see. If we have questions as we go along, please interrupt me. That's okay. Requiring freeboard over fill. I think, again, this one is currently a builder can use fill to elevate the average ground level around the building. And so then you're kind of elevating it up to the base flood elevation, and you don't have to incorporate a freeboard. There are towns, the strategy would basically require that you still incorporate freeboard and you still raise the lowest level of the structure above to the freeboard level. So there would still be a difference between that existing grade and the lowest level of the structure. encouraging, oh, sorry, I don't want to skip anything. Projected sea level rise, showing that required projected sea level rise on a subdivision application. Basically, this strategy would look at, those sea level rise projections that John Callahan presented very early on in this whole process, and looking at a certain planning horizon and requiring that be shown on your subdivision applications. It's not necessarily saying that there's standards that go along with it, but it at least is a part where we're starting, and we can talk about what those standards might be if we were to go in that direction. But that basically is a starting point for the conversation, and at least acknowledging sea level rise and showing how they would affect the proposed subdivision going forward, whether it be 50 years, 70 years, whatever planning horizon is discussed as part of that strategy. In terms of the next one, so permeable paving, this is something that we spoke about at length at the last meeting with Charlie joined us, and the sense that it is a system and not just a product that allows for water to infiltrate into the ground, and it can't be used everywhere. There are site-specific conditions that need to be met, and and the city is already using it for streets, for the public streets that they are have jurisdiction over where it's appropriate. So what this committee could consider is actually the use of permeable paving on individual sites, in which case it would be, the strategy would be to amend the zoning ordinance and to incorporate permeable paving. And this is something, again, that we did see in the Norfolk ordinance and going forward. Next one is the landscape standards. And so in regards to reevaluating landscape standards, as I think we did mention before, there is a subdivision committee that the city has, and they are looking at strengthening existing landscape standards. So looking at tree protection, looking at tree replacement, street trees, and native species, all those types of things that, as we know, landscaping adds to the green infrastructure of the city. It has its own ability to reduce runoff, store water, provide cooling effects, lots of things that enhance the resiliency of the city. And so while that committee is working on landscaping from the subdivision aspect, right now, if somebody comes in just under a zoning review or a building permit that gets a zoning review, the standards that are in the subdivision are not applicable to those individual sites. And so this committee could look at that and look at that gap and say, we would like to recommend, or we would like to look at adding those landscape standards to the zoning ordinance, and so that it becomes more applicable if trees are taken down for development or new landscaping uses native species, salt tolerant species, etc. Increasing open space that's required in new development. Again, I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. Standard subdivisions right now have a 10% open space set aside requirement. If you do a cluster ordinance, there's a higher percentage, and basically that's offset by the individual parcels that homes are built on are allowed to be smaller so that you are preserving more open space. One of the best practices could be to increase the required amount of open space in both of those types, one or both, I should say, of those types of subdivision in order to preserve more area that, again, adds to landscaping, adds to the ability to deal with floodwaters, and makes the city more resilient. Limiting and prohibiting subdivision in the floodplain. So Lewes right now allows a subdivision to occur in a floodplain, and that is not true of everywhere. Kent County, for instance, in Delaware, does not permit the subdivision within the floodplain. And so floodplain cannot be on an individual lot. If you're doing for new subdivisions, it has to be within open space. And basically, taking that approach of not building anymore, not reducing the capacity of the floodplain, and not endangering those future residents or commercial businesses that are located in there. Maximum lot coverages. Again, I think this is one that has been brought up repeatedly throughout this whole process. And so I don't feel the need to go too far into it. You know, as we saw from Janelle's table from the October 28th meeting, it compared the lot coverage permitted in Lewes versus other coastal communities. And Lewes is allows one of the highest lot coverages on an individual lot, looking across those communities. And so lowering that through a variety of strategies is something that this committee can consider in terms of a zoning ordinance amendment. Increasing wetland buffer widths. Again, wetlands play a vital role in flood mitigation, improving water quality. The current buffer width is 50 feet. There is an option for averaging, but best practices that we see in other places, you know, Brandywine Conservancy or other land trusts and you know, the Georgetown Climate Center show that best practices are those buffers are increased to 100 feet, you know, surrounding those wetlands, if not higher. And preferably are vegetated so that they help, again, to slow floodwaters, improve water quality of the runoff. Reevaluating the stormwater utility fee. You know, again, this is a mechanism that funds the cost of municipal services that are directly related to the control and treatment of stormwater. Because impervious surface is a direct contributor to stormwater runoff, and there's a direct correlation. A lot of times, and in many best practices, the stormwater fee is directly related to the impervious coverage that is on a lot. Right now, Lewis's the stormwater fee is a flat fee per residential water meter. And so Lewes, you know, this committee could say, and want to talk about that and recommend revisiting the structure of that fee and that fund so that there is a stronger tie between the cause and effect. Make sure I have everything. Okay. The next one, the Resilience Fund, Storm Emergency Relief Fund. And so, you know, we've used the examples of Bethany Beach and of Sussex County, where they've taken a tax on lodging, or taken a tax on rentals, or even in Bethany Beach's case, an increase in property tax. And then that money is put into a fund that is specifically used for a specific purpose, and it has a resiliency purpose. The way that they have structured that is one example. This committee could choose that they want to talk about creating a fund that does support resiliency efforts and, you know, improving, you know, whether it's recovery from a storm or infrastructure improvements or any types of thing that could do resiliency. It doesn't have to exactly reflect the models that have been put out there by Sussex and Bethany. And then so we're down to the last three. Stormwater Reconstruction Ordinance. This model ordinance refers to one that I spoke about at the last meeting from Nags Head, North Carolina. It's basically putting a pause on development after a major storm event so that the city can take a breather, not necessarily take a breather, but to have a chance to like catch its breath, assess what damage has been done, and then assess what the logical way of allowing for redevelopment and allowing for recovery to happen in a logical and safe way. And so, again, the pause, you know, in Nags Head, North Carolina has different phases. And so it starts out with like 48 hours and then a week, and then, you know, kind of explore those options in terms of allowing rebuilding to occur. And then finally, requiring a real estate disclosure. This takes a little different approach than the other ones, right? The other ones are requiring something to happen in terms of construction or building. This one is taking the stance that the homeowner or prospective homeowner has the right to acknowledge that sea level rise is a real issue and flooding is an issue for a particular property. And so it mandates that be disclosed as part of a real estate transaction. And it becomes part of the contract that is signed by both seller and buyer. And there are examples, again, in the states of California and Hawaii, both require this, as well as some small towns in South Carolina. And we did want to put on here the thought of that maybe none of the above strategies, and like I said, we are open to other strategies as long as they meet the parameters of this group, right? Is we're looking at a community-wide strategy, something that's community-wide, not necessarily just looking at Bay Avenue or Cedar Street, not necessarily looking at an engineering project, but looking at regulatory and ordinances, strategies that will affect them or amend those in a way that increase the resiliency. But we do want to provide, that option that, there are places that aren't going to do anything. There are places that won't take these steps, but, is that something that you all, as part of this committee, are willing to do? And so, unless there's any specific questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let the conversation begin. Are there questions? Chris Cerulli, go ahead, or Caroli, sorry.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that, Jen. One thing that's come up quite a bit in these meetings is, why we're not talking more about specifically the beach, protecting the beach and things that we could be doing, that maybe are a little more front and center. Could you just speak to that and just get it out there why it is we're not talking about that more or really at all?
Sure. I mean, again, after the storm events of late and everything that is on the top of people's minds, but the beach and the dunes and beach replenishment are all directly controlled by the state. They are not controlled by, and anybody from DENREC, just please correct me if I'm misspeaking, but the idea behind this committee was to have have regulatory and ordinance changes that Lewes in and of itself can do, as a community, and that affects the community wide. That certainly those other there's many pieces of the puzzle that are mitigating sea level rise and mitigating flooding. And our piece of the puzzle are the ordinances and regulations that Lewes has direct control over at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Joe, you're muted. Joe, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I have a court hearing in 10 minutes, so I have to leave, but I agree that even though the beach area is primarily a federal or state responsibility, I think we should look at that if we're talking about controlling flooding on Lewes Beach. Secondly, as I indicated in another note, I think we need to hear from that committee that's addressing measures to deal with flooding along Cedar Avenue before we really do anything more. What are they doing? What's their result? What's their suggestions? And I'd also, I'm sorry. I also would like to know what is the direct impact of an increase in sea level rise on properties in the city. It seems to me, my impression is more an issue of rainfall rather than sea level rise, but I'm just not that conversant with the properties in the city that are in the floodplain. And at least for some of us, it would be helpful to know what that relationship is. And even at the beach, I think you can assume that there's a sea level rise that's going to impact flooding, but that flooding comes from the canal, and what's that impact? One thing I asked Charlie to, and I still haven't got a response, was could you dredge the canal? And would that make any measurable impact? And then there's what are our solutions to flooding in the area on the beach, in the area of the Dairy Queen, Savannah Road? Specifically, how are we going to address them? And lastly, I think the real estate disclosure is a great idea. I think it should go even further than that. It shouldn't be any permits issued by the city, because a lot of times people are not necessarily selling their property, but they want to rebuild their, build a new property. And I think they should have a, before there's a permit, they should have have to sign a document that indicates the risk if they don't, if they may incur if they don't raise their property even beyond what may be required. And I think that people can make good decisions, and they should have an opportunity to consider that. And on the sea level rise, I just like to hear more about what is the spread on that. The figure I have is, I don't know where, I think I got it from NASA, is something like 3.47 millimeters per year. And if that's the case, you know, you're talking somewhere between 20 and 24 inches. But I like to have a better understanding what that range is as pertains to Lewes. So there are my thoughts. I really have to go, but I just want to pass those on.
Well, thank you. Before you go, and I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I can't stay with it. So are there other, so I wrote down real estate disclosure of being one of your 5. Are there any other solutions on that, or strategies on that list that you think are worth?
Well, sea level, I mean, freeboard, that's, you know, that's a major issue. I forget all the ones on the list, to be honest with you now, but
I mean, I can bring it back up. I just wanted to get your input before
yeah,
you.
bring it back up and I'll just tell you quickly.
Yeah, so that we have your list to add in. And so there's the freeboard.
Freeboard. And I think in connection with the freeboard, as you mentioned, I think you have to consider whether you're going to permit any increase in height, because I think people would be more willing to increase the freeboard voluntarily if there was some increase in height. And I know that I think that Fenwick does that up to a certain height beyond which you can't go, even if you elevate your house, say 3 feet. I think it's limited to pretty much what something less than that. And I think landscape standards are important. I think trees are extremely important. I heard last night about the city's plans for increasing their tree coverage. I think there should be, there's already a lot of trees on the beach. I think there should be more. And
Up to 3.
let me see, could you scroll down?
Sure, sorry about that.
Well, I'm not particularly enamored of lowering the maximum lot coverage unless I know more.
Relationship.
They're the ones
Okay, so those,
that strike me as important.
okay, great. So the
Okay, I got to run. Thanks.
landscape. Thanks, Joe. Okay. Great. All right. Does anyone else have any questions or any discussion about any of the specific strategies, or you just want to talk about jump into your preferred strategies.
This is Tom Panetta. And this is just a comment, just so everyone's aware of. There are two items on here which are actually not part of the city ordinances. They're part of the BPW regulations. And BPW is looking at them and is more than willing to take input. But they're not things that can actually be written into city ordinances. And the two of those would be the stormwater utility fee.
Mhm.
And the second one was, it's not necessarily the resiliency fund storm management, storm relief. BPW has a reserve policy that requires a certain number of millions of dollars be set aside for post-storm recovery. And that is currently under evaluation to determine whether its the level is correct for right now. And the one thing I would like to add to the storm fee is someone had said that it was whether, increasing it to address the consequences of or the impact of pervious versus impervious. The way the stormwater fee is set is actually to cover the maintenance of the system. So it's the cleaning of the gutter, of the drains, of the basins, the cleaning of the piping systems, the rebuilding of the piping systems. It is not, that fee was never set. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but that fee was never set to address flooding issues. So I just wanted to clarify that before we went on.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And you're right. I should know better that it was under BPW, but as long as you said you're okay, BPW is okay with us maintaining, having input on that from this committee if they so choose.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, BPW is as concerned with infrastructure and the impact of storms on the system. So, totally open to it.
Fantastic. Okay. Phil.
I just want to clarify one thing to piggyback off of what Tom said. The emergency relief fund could be used for any number of things, right? So BPW has its reserve that does not prohibit or limit the city from also developing a reserve that it would use for resiliency measures.
I totally agree. I just wanted to say there's actually there's a need for two separate reserve funds. We're responsible for rebuilding the power lines, the sewer systems, the water systems post-storm. The city is responsible for streets and other infrastructure.
Okay, great. Anyone else have any general comments or questions? Thoughts? Jim?
Alrighty. So I'm just actually a little confused. Doesn't take much, but I'm a little confused as far as the direction of this committee. It seemed like everything on that list, not everything, but there was the majority of the items on that list dealt with a new ordinance. So I guess what I thought this was going to be was more of a resiliency plan, which would be more of a comprehensive plan as far as how will the city help mitigate storms, how will the city help recover from a major storm event, which I believe is what the definition in this case would be of resiliency. So I am encouraged to hear Mr. Panetta talk about how BPW would be more than willing to take input, because on my list of items, it's not necessarily as specific. It's more of, yes, we need to look at ordinances. I think also part of this plan, we should be looking at public utilities and how effective they are during and after major storm events. Because that affects us. It affects us all. It affects the city, it affects the emergency services. I do think we need to look at elevation of the streets and access. I mean, I know there's times where Brock Hill Prime Hook can't be accessed unless the Brock Hill Road that a particular landowner owns and operates is opened up for access to get to Prime Hook during some of these events, storm events. So something, it was kind of similar trying to access Cedar Street, a recent event during some recent high tide events. So I think that's should be part of it. I think communication, like public communication, communication with the public. I think that that one item with the disclosure for the real estate is fantastic. I think that's part of communication, but we also have to look at the people that live in the city that, like a lot of these ordinances are geared towards individual properties of new construction or major rebuild construction in flood zones. And most of those properties have a certain socioeconomic status to them. If you're going to rebuild, that's going to be a certain socioeconomic status. And I feel like resiliency affects lower socioeconomic status, the most vulnerable people as well. So I do think we need to look at some of these more broad plan issue, coastal shoreline. What exactly are we doing for our back bays, our canal restoration projects, which I feel like the city is doing. I just don't, and coordinating with other state organizations, I just don't feel like it's part of a comprehensive plan. I just feel like we're throwing a lot of matter on the wall and seeing what sticks, because these individual ordinances, I feel like it's the same rabbit hole that the original sea level rise committee went down and actually caused quite an uproar, and that's why we're here. So I'd like to get people's thoughts on that, and whether I'm way off base or whether we're not. But it just seems like there just isn't and maybe there is, but maybe that's part of the communication issue. It just doesn't seem like there is a comprehensive plan that this city has for resiliency. And I thought that's the path that we were going to take, and not so much getting into the weeds as to what these individual items are.
Sure. So let me take a step back real quick and just say that, we have the charge for this committee, right? And that we all went over that in the very beginning. I see what you're saying about a plan, and I'll let the city kind of answer to the status of the comprehensive plan, because I know they have that, and it is, sea level rise is addressed as part of that plan. But with this committee's charge, it does say, and I'll quote, and I'm reading it specifically, I can bring it up, but it is anticipated that the LACR will provide recommendations regarding ways to ensure that city ordinances and regulations address the need to balance city growth with the challenges of the changing environment. As I said, the city has many committees, and we're one piece of that puzzle. And so and our piece is to look at those ordinances, and that's kind of why the committee has been structured as it's been so far. And why we did kind of Janelle brought in a couple of slides that address what the city, what some of the other committees were doing, just so that was a part of it. But but really what we've been trying to do is walk through what the existing ordinances do and what the city in its own ordinances and regulations can do. And that's a vital part of what the RCP, the Resilient Community Partnership that DENREC and IPA were brought in, that was the purpose of that project.
Janice, can I follow up on that?
Please.
So, yeah, I totally understand the charge of the committee, and it seems like, it's always been more of a regulatory approach.
to resiliency. But to follow up what Jim was discussing, to me, clearly there is a role for ordinances and regulations to kind of mitigate flooding in our town. But it does seem that, and again, I'm not sure this is the purview of this committee, but there are other mitigation strategies that we should be discussing, in particular, for example, berms or sea walls, things like that. Recently, you referred to earlier the recent weather we had in Lewes, and where Savannah Road was closed because of the flooding coming from the marsh. I don't know how, I spoke to 2 or 3 different people, and we all kind of just sat around and figured, just from a common sense perspective, if we built a berm between the Lewes drawbridge and the American Legion Road, probably wouldn't be cheap, but probably would protect, at least to some degree, Savannah Road. And so I'm just wondering if there is room, or we're just going to focus on ordinances to discuss mitigation, capital projects like that may be very effective in protecting Lewes from major weather events. But thank you, Jim, for bringing that up, because I think it's probably, to me, it's a combination of both ordinance, regulatory approaches, as well as capital projects.
I guess my recollection, and I don't, is Bob on? I don't see him, but my recollection was that with the Resilient Community Partnership, the part of the reason for the focus on policy was because they're looking for things that can be replicated elsewhere. And it doesn't mean that there aren't public works projects that the city and the board should consider, but my understanding from the beginning of this, in terms of the Resilient Community Partnership Program, is that it really was looking at developing policies and solutions that would be able to be replicated by other communities. So
I would agree with what Anne-Marie has just said. I think Khalil has a point, and I think Jim's points are well made. But there are other committees looking at some of this, and as has been acknowledged already, some of the things like dredging the canal and are well beyond the purview of the city. And that doesn't mean we don't work with DENREC and the Army Corps to try and get that done. I think there have been articles in the Cape Gazette recently about how the fact that is not on anybody's list currently, and yet we have letters into the governor and to both Senator Carper and Senator Coons regarding the need, the urgent need to have that done. It's been more than 20 years since the canal was dredged. So some of these, I think what this committee was designed to do was look at things that we as a community can really regulate and do something with. That does not negate the idea that we should be working with other agencies at all. And in fact, there is work going on. I think everyone's aware that we are a member of the 7 coastal communities trying to work together to get coastal resiliency and beach replenishment going on a whole region basis. So there's no oversight of that. It's just that's already going on at a different level.
Understood. Jim, I'll go back to you.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like, all that's great. It just sounds like there might be a communication misstep here, because I feel like if we are then looking at ordinances, which, we have been, that's fine. So what is that like? Oh, what is the city's overall plan? Like you mentioned, like there's a lot of different committees. So are they all just kind of spread out, or is there like is there some overall comprehensive plan that these certain committees are looking at these certain parts? Because that I feel like has not been presented. So, you know, so if we're looking at just the ordinances of certain areas, that's fine. But I feel like the comprehensive overall plan of what other committees are looking into, and like, I just don't think that's like that plan has been communicated in what we kind of fall under. Does that make sense? I mean, you just kind of think of like a,
Right.
you know, some sort of hierarchy.
Trying
Yes,
to visualize the overall overarching direction.
yes, absolutely.
And maybe at some point we can explore that a little bit more, but I'm vitally aware that time is ticking and I need to get some committee input on the ordinances today. And, you know, and again, I don't think, you know, when we started this process, we did say that there was we were hoping to have, you know, recommendations by, you know, late winter, early spring. And I think looking at all of these other pieces would take us far beyond that and far beyond the commitment that you all have made to this committee. And so, you know, our priority in moving through this is to look at the ordinances and get those recommendations. And then, you know, and we can build on that and talk about some of those other conversations along the way. But Kina, let me go ahead to you.
Hear me all right?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, very good. The comment about we are supposed to be coming up with ideas or addressing ordinances that can be replicated by other communities. That's the first time I've heard of that through all of this. And quite frankly, I think we need to concentrate on Lewes. Lewes is different than a lot of these communities. And if we happen to come out with policies that we be applicable in other areas, that's fine. But that, you know, trying to create something for others to replicate should not be our first goal.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is why we're looking at Lewis's ordinances and looking at best practice. We have to figure out what will work for Lewes. So why don't we, you know, again, so that we can have the path forward for our next several meetings, go ahead and, you know, provide input on what strategies we want to discuss more. And so
can I say one more thing?
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's okay. In reference to what the other gentlemen were saying, I do think what we should do is maybe that these other focal points would be suggestions and recommendations. For example, the Savannah Road flooding. This has been all of my life and people before me. This is not new, and some very simple things that could be recommended. And the more we recommend that might make a difference in how imperative it is, it might get more attention. Now I'm done.
Understood.
Next time.
Thank you again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share my screen again, and I have basically an Excel sheet where I can write down what everybody's top 5 are. I do have Marta's in my and her file that she sent and what she thought were the top 5. Names are written in alphabetical order. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And so Jim, are you okay with going first?
Sure. Yeah, I guess my top 5 are probably not even on here, honestly. So I'm not sure. So maybe I am none of the above. Because I feel like a lot of these are things that we're asking the individual lot owner to help protect their particular property. It doesn't necessarily help, like as Kina was saying, like Savannah Road's flooded, and like, so how does the emergency vehicles access that road? Like I feel like there's a bigger picture here. So I feel like it's none of the above, honestly, for my top 5.
Fair enough. All right. Chris.
Okay, so I got to follow that.
Sorry.
Nowhere to go but up.
So, hey, Jim, I hear you. To be honest, I struggled, you know, with this list, and what I'm trying to do is look at this in terms of, I am gonna pick 5, and I don't look at it as, I'm basically saying that the 5 things I pick are what I want to do. I'm picking 5 that I want to learn more about. And if it leads to, recommending some of this stuff, okay, great. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I'm not looking at it as, all right, I'm picking these 5 because I really want to make these 5 happen. That's not where I'm at, for sure. But anyway, just to keep this short, I'm definitely very interested in the real estate disclosure. I'm in the mortgage business, so that's kind of right up my alley. I think that's pretty benign, and I think it's a good thing, and I'm very interested in taking a look at that. I would like to learn more on reevaluating the landscape standards and see if there can be improvements made in that.
Okay.
Let's see, increasing the amount of open space required in new developments.
Right.
I would like to take a look at that. Freeboard. We're Lewes is at 18 inches. That may be where we should be, but I would like to learn more about that and see if that's something that should be improved upon. If that means increasing it, okay. If building height goes along with that, that could be something that's not too detrimental to a homeowner. And I guess lastly, the reevaluating the stormwater utility fee to align with impervious coverage.
Okay. Right, and then Joe gave us his, which were the real estate disclosure, the landscape standards, and Freeboard. Okay, Drew?
Freeboard, 100-year Freeboard.
Okay.
Lot coverage. Open space. Prohibit construction in the floodplain. And the wetland buffer. And just as another comment on the disclosure, I think that's a good idea, and I like the notion that the disclosure is not just on real estate transactions, but on permits. But here's a weird alternative or an addition to that. Might it be possible, and I will say up front, I'm not a Delaware lawyer, so I don't know if this is possible. Might it be possible to accompany that disclosure with the creation of a cause of action for individuals or for the city for people who don't mitigate against flooding? While there may be some statute now that allows for some kind of action for intentional harm or otherwise, I'm wondering if in fact there could be a showing that an individual or a business or whatever did not take mitigating steps, that we could empower a cause of action in the city of Lewes by the city or by neighbors, individuals who are affected by the failure to mitigate, as one way to incentivize mitigation. And I know that that speaks specifically to individuals or businesses, but I think peer pressure may be even more effective than some of the other matters. But that's just a tangent on the notice and disclosure.
Okay, no, it's a great something we're looking into. Okay, so Marta's, I'm sorry, did someone else? Okay. So Marta's top 5 were lowering the maximum lot coverage, increasing open space in new developments, limiting, prohibiting development in the floodplain, reevaluating the stormwater utility fee, and increasing wetland buffers. Okay. Tom. Is Tom still here?
He was.
Sorry about that. I had to
There you go.
So two items that are not on the list, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record. As we've heard from NOAA, FEMA, the Atlas 14 precipitation data is no longer valid, and it's not going to be updated. We do have the authority to create our own numbers to use. And I think the AECOM report needs to be rerun so we understand the vulnerability. And while the focus keeps on being said about the beach, there's a very large portion of Lewes, which is back bay flooding, Canary Creek and the Delaware Bay, and has nothing to do with the beach. And without understanding the impact of sea level rise and the increased precipitation on those areas, we are missing a very large portion of the flooding issue. So that would be one of my items. And just to reiterate, currently the AECOM study says that the 2-year coastal storm is combined with the 100-year precipitation. And the 100-year coastal storm is combined with the 10-year precipitation. And as we've seen from many of the recent hurricanes, the 100-year coastal storm is combined with a 500-year precipitation event. So that would be my number one for understanding the vulnerability and coming up with correct standards.
Okay.
The second one, stormwater reconstruction ordinance. What I would add to that is that rather than it be just a pause, we need to put on, whether it's an ordinance or some stated position of the city, what the rebuilding policy is going to be post-storm.
Okay.
So it doesn't affect anything that is existing, and it doesn't affect anyone up until the point that a storm comes in, Sandy, and everything is wiped out. At that point, you don't want to rebuild to the current standards. You want to rebuild to a more stringent standard. And having people know what those are now, when the sun is shining, although it's dark out, is I think good information for the citizenry. Lot coverage. And I know that there was some prior ones that voted on open space. To me, lot coverage would encompass open space, because the open space ordinance, as it's currently written into our ordinances, includes stormwater retention ponds, paved trails, other things. And so I would rather see that we look at lot coverage as a mean of addressing the pervious impervious than just open space. Requiring sea level rise to be disclosed and shown on applications. And then, the discussion on Freeboard may not even be necessary if, as I suggested, we use better precipitation data, because we're already taking the uncertainty out by using better data. And the 18-inch Freeboard may be sufficient. However, if we're not going to address that Atlas 14 is grossly out of date, then I would vote for Freeboard.
I'm going to go ahead and put the little tally in the Freeboard, because I don't think that we can put that under discussion, but I don't know that that's in our purview. Okay, thank you. Rodney? I thought I saw him.
He was there.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Okay, yep.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would agree. I think we need to look at the freeboard issue. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we need to look at it. You've shown it separate from freeboard overfill. I think I would combine those two, frankly, and look at them together. I also think that we need to look at open space requirements and tag that on along with maximum lot coverages. So I think those two are important. I think we ought to pay attention to wetland buffers and widths. Now, I know we're talking about the city only and it's a small town, but it seems to me that we need to look at that. And also, I think the disclosure is important, would be very helpful to people. And that goes with what people were saying about communication and letting everybody know what's going on. I still don't have a real good sense of where the most vulnerable portions of the city are. Maybe I just missed it. But also, I don't have a sense of, I don't want to treat the entire city as if it's one chunk of land. I think it would be beneficial if we had an understanding, if we're talking about development, where land is suitable, most suitable for development, and where it's maybe not suitable or even less suitable for development. And that has to do with flood zones. It also has to do with wetlands and closeness to wetlands, and it has to do with soils and all kinds of other things. And I see permeable paving on here. That can only be done and only makes sense when the soils can handle it. And I also see that it's being looked at by a subdivision of the subdivision code committee. So I don't know that we need to duplicate their work. Likewise, in the drainage, there's a subcommittee looking into I guess streets and that. So anyway, those were my 5.
Great, thank you. All right, Kina, you're up.
All right, let's see here.
Just tick them off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. Well, I do agree as we go through this and we get talking about each one, I think I like the ideas that we're leaving, many of us want to leave it open for further discussion so we truly understand. And if we're turning some of these into ordinances, we need to consider the impact to the people that are affected. So looking at this, I want to reserve my opinion on the freeboard. I know that we've covered it. I want to look more at the consequences, partly because I think if somebody's building a new home in a new development, it's not necessarily a problem. But when certain ordinances are put in place that affect the older homes that people want to maintain, or put on an addition, or part of their structure was damaged, but the other part wasn't, and then they're affected by some of these rules. So I want to be very careful to see how that applies before I make an opinion on that.
Well, and again, remember, we are just picking which ones we do want to discuss further. And so if that is of interest in just learning more, then that might fall within that list, your 5 list. But go ahead. I don't let me interrupt.
And when you were talking about the V zone regs, one of the things that I caught was Kent County did an incentive. I would like to learn more about how something like that would apply here. I felt like that was one area that I needed more understanding about, or maybe I've missed it and I have to go back and listen to our meetings again.
Mm-hmm. No, we did not get into to that level of detail. Again, that's kind of where, before we got into that level of detail with all 17 of these potentials, we wanted to see what everyone really wanted to talk about. So
Gotcha. When it comes to the application on the projected SLR, my question would be, if someone is making this application, how would they ascertain what the SLR is? Is there going to be a reliable resource that they can go to? What kind of costs would be involved? So I want to talk about that more. I'm inclined to think that's a good idea, but I would like to see how we would do more with that.
Yep.
The next one underneath that, encouraging the increase of permeable paving. I think that's an excellent idea where it can apply. And I understand that, you know, our soils, and there's a lot of variables that could affect that. I think that could be you know, something that could be highly encouraged. I don't want punitive damages for most of these things. I want encouragement and things that can really make a difference into what people are doing. Same thing with like the landscape. I think encouraging the education about what's the best landscape to meet the needs would be very good. And so I think we should explore that possibility further. But I don't necessarily think that this is the only thing that you can put in your yard, or else I'm not in favorable something. The open space and developments, I had a chance to attend the county council, the mayor and city council meeting last night. And they gave a report from the subdivision committee, and she talked at some length about the open spaces. And what I heard with that, I was very, very impressed by that. So I would support something like that. I'm trying to think, how many have I said so far?
Well, you pretty much said.
Well, I was kind of going down the list.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of walking through each one, but not necessarily. So you talked about Freeboard, talked about the V-zone regulations, projected sea level rise on future applications, permeable paving.
I got it. Okay. I'm going to skip down and not talk about so much each one unless they come up. Taking into account Tom's comments about the stormwater utility fee, where it's right now it's $5 per residential water meter. I do think this might warrant some looking at, because there might be something that whether it's the city working with BPW or a separate fund that could, you know, be very beneficial. I don't think what's being done is unreasonable or causes hardship for any member of our community. And well, I think that goes hand in hand with the storm relief emergency fund underneath that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 here. So we gotta narrow that one down a little bit more. So,
all right. Well, part of why I started saying that, and I apologize, was because of the comments about wanting to learn more.
mhm.
And that was part of my take on the floodplain issues with the first two, you know.
Right.
All right, my 5 would be the encouragement for the permeable paving. The open space, the one above open space on the landscape standards, that's 3.
Yep.
The stormwater utility fee and create the resilience fund stormwater emergency relief.
All right, you got it.
As the other ones come up, I might feel differently, but I want to explore them more.
Absolutely. Okay, Khalil.
Thank you, Jen. So I'm looking at these, and I have been looking at these through the resiliency prism, and understanding that we're not going to be able to stop, obviously, a major weather event, but, you know, adhering to the definition of resiliency, especially in the environmental mode, you know, how do we withstand it and how do we recover from such an event? And so with that in mind, my top 5, I'll begin with number 1, and that is the Freeboard in the 100-year floodplain, including adjusting for the building height. That impacts a vast amount of the community. And I think really goes a long way towards protecting property and life. Two would be encouraging and requiring the use of permeable paving and other surfaces like that. I believe, again, infiltration as much as we can have regarding that, I think is going to help us absorb a major weather event. In line with that, I did not choose increased amount of open space required in new developments because simply I'm not certain there's a lot of new developments in the city of Lewes that are going to be considered. I don't know there's a lot of land that would be developable. I mean, being able to be developed. So, but I am certainly conscious of open space in areas that are permeable. Moving on, I'm not sure how effective, landscape standards would be, but I would certainly like to explore that more because I've heard from many people about trees and how they absorb water and how they can potentially serve as protection for runoff and things like that. So that interests me, and I think that could be effective. Here's my fourth, is the one that no one's mentioned yet, I don't believe, and that is creating a resiliency fund similar to what Bethany has. I think that's certainly worth exploring because again, it fits at least with my definition and my model, my lens of how are we going to be able to recover from an event and deal with it. So I would definitely like to explore that. And then the real estate disclosure as number 5, I think that's that makes a lot of sense, and we should discuss that further.
Great, thank you for all those comments. Okay, Candace.
Hello. My first one is the raising the freeboard in the 100-year floodplain. The next one for me is increasing open space. And when I think about that, I think about potential lands that might be annexed into the city of Lewes, and then development of those would be part and parcel of that. Let's see, consider lowering the maximum lot coverage. And when I think about that, I think about accessory buildings more than the actual principal residence within that part of the city code. The Resilience Fund is the next on my list. And Storm Reconstruction Ordinance is my final one.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Frank.
Well, I think much like Jim Baker, I'm probably going to have a hard time coming up with 5. I'll certainly give you what I would consider my 3 that I think are no-brainers. One is the real estate disclosure. That's great. A storm reconstruction ordinance. I think Tom Panetta touched on that some, and that I think that bears an awful lot of thought and discussion. We have to have that what if conversation. Although historically we've always fared fairly well in some big storms. Not to say that there isn't a bigger one coming tomorrow, and then along those lines, I think the storm reconstruction ordinance and the resiliency fund, storm emergency relief, should they kind of go hand in hand. So, and one that we've talked about that isn't on this list is, our actual infrastructure. And Jim Baker talked about, what about the roads when the floods come? Even though our houses are dry, there's some roads that are problematic. So I think we have to include infrastructure, and that includes roads, utilities. There's been the thought of some berms discussed a little bit, and obviously, although we're not allowed to talk about it, but the wastewater treatment plant, that has to be considered by somebody. And if I could just touch on a couple of the other ones, because I do have some thoughts, not necessarily including them on my list. Raising the freeboard works for a little while, but then once the sea level rise reaches a certain point, you can't get to your property because the road's underwater. So your house might be 20 feet out of the ground, but you can't get there. So in some sense, it's stopgap unless you say, well, oh, just kidding, sea level is only going to rise an additional 3 or 4 feet, just to pick a number, and then it's going to go back down. And who knows that? Regulating the 5-year floodplain, you got to be careful there because you would instantly create a large number of properties that are non-conforming. We have a number of properties in Lewes that are in the 500-year floodplain that may or may not conform, I don't know. The V-zone regs, with regard to it creating a coastal AE zone, I don't think Lewes, I don't think that's applicable in Lewes. You see the coastal A zones more in communities like North Shores. I've designed many houses in North Shores where we, you know, even though they're in an A, we treat them like a coastal A or actually a V zone. So I'm going to pick North Shores Dewey and some of the communities south of the Indian River Inlet Bridge, clean down to Bethany and Fenwick for that matter. Those are much more suitable to having a coastal A zone than Lewes. And primarily it's because of the existence of the breakwater. I don't think you could make the same argument for example, Broadkill Beach, Prime Hook, Slaughter Beach, even Bowers, because of the amount of open water they have in front of them. The permeable paving and things like that, yeah, that's a nice idea, but when the tide comes in, it doesn't matter how permeable your pavement is. The water is going to come up. So and I'm not going to go through the entire list, but
Say, let me stop you there. That's great input, and I'm sure the conversations will go on. And so, you know, I know there's a lot of reservations about other areas that you want to look at, and always the need for more information. You know, as we move along, you know, that uncertainty is just part of, it's something that we just have to kind of work with. We never have all of the data or all of the information that we want when we're making decisions. But you have helped set a framework for future conversations. And so, as you saw on the board, the Freeboard, exploring increasing the Freeboard, got 7 votes to look at, followed by increasing the open space in subdivisions, had 6 votes. Exploring the idea of lowering lot coverage, got 5, also got 5, getting 5 was the real estate disclosure. So those are the top 4. And then for the next place was the resilience fund, creating a resiliency fund and looking at landscape standards, both got 4 votes. And so those are the items that we will be focusing on moving forward. Again, having that conversation, not necessarily, you know, looking at, can we make those recommendations? And so our next meeting is November 23rd, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Just let me, yes. So November 23rd. And we do have a few minutes for any public comment or any other.
And this is Ted, this is Ted Becker for a minute. I know there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of question about why was a wastewater treatment plant excluded from this community's consideration. And I think it's important to understand that we are well aware that the wastewater treatment plant's location is within the floodplain. And we're also well aware that moving that plant is a multi-million-dollar, $100+ million effort that would require a lot more than the city involvement. We have, Khalil and I participated in a conversation with Senator Carper's staff, along with Presley, where we talked about funding for the possibility of relocation, but also funding for hardening the existing plant where it is. And that conversation is going on separate from this, recognizing that anything that we would do along those lines would be beyond the ability of the city to pay for. When we spoke with Senator Carper's staff, they reminded us that this would be something that would come through state revolving funds. So it's federal money that would come to the state, and we would have to work with DENREC to have this accomplished. So we are working on the wastewater treatment plant. It's just not something we felt this committee should be spending primarily its time on. It is something we are trying to look at from two aspects, relocation, but also the aspect of hardening it.
Great, thank you. That was helpful. Okay, so are there any other comments or questions? Anything from the public?
Almost say it's so important, it deserves its own.
Jen, I've got, I don't know if we have public that want to speak, but I did want to mention, a number of the issues that kind of came up that are not, I guess, tasked to this committee are really part of what the mitigation planning team works on. So, I mean, that group meets quarterly. And I think our next meeting, I think, is December 2nd or something. Right. So I would certainly encourage people to tune into those meetings, because there are meaningful discussions about a number of things that the city's working on, everywhere from emergency preparedness to Phragmites management to, just being ready for whatever ends up hitting us.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, then I thank you all for your thoughtful comments and for your thoughtful votes on the future steps for this committee. And we will see you on November 23rd. And unless there's any other comments, we will take a motion to adjourn.
Thanksgiving?
It's Tuesday before.
Tuesday before.
Before Thanksgiving, yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jen. Appreciate your help here. Thank you. Thanks everyone for your participation.